The dust of Harmony Creek tasted of grit and iron. It settled on everything, the unpainted storefronts that leaned against one another like tired drunks, the warped planks of the boardwalk, the faded letters of the sign for the First Bank of Harmony Creek. The sun was a merciless hammer beating down from a bleached white sky, and the only thing that moved was the heat haze shimmering above the single dirt road. Selah May Hartwell felt the town's silent judgment as acutely as the heat on her skin. She had arrived 2 days prior, a ghost walking out of the prairie, with nothing but a worn dress and a desperate hope for work. That hope had curdled into a familiar, gnawing fear. She clutched the silver locket around her neck, its cool metal a stark contrast to the oppressive warmth. It was the last thing her mother had given her, a smooth, small comfort against a world that had offered none. The sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the afternoon stupor. Screams erupted from the bank. People scattered like quail diving behind water troughs and barrels. Selah, who had been about to inquire about washing laundry at the hotel, froze on the boardwalk. A man in a dark coat, his face obscured by a filthy burlap sack with crude holes cut for eyes, burst through the swinging doors of the bank. He clutched a canvas sack heavy with coin and currency. His wild, panicked eyes scanned the street and landed on her. Selah, the newcomer, the stranger, the perfect scapegoat. He lunged toward her, his breath a foul gust of whiskey and fear. Before she could react, he shoved a small, distinctive leather satchel into her hands. It was surprisingly heavy, its leather tooled with an intricate pattern of dogwood blossoms. "Hold this," he rasped, his voice a panicked growl. Then he was gone, sprinting down the alley between the saloon and the smithy, vanishing into the maze of backlots and forgotten shacks. The canvas sack of money went with him. The leather satchel remained in her hands. For a heartbeat, the world was silent again, save for the frantic pounding in Selah's ears. Then the bank doors swung open again, and a woman's voice, sharp with authority, cried out, "Stop her! She's his accomplice." Heads popped up. Eyes narrowed with suspicion and fear all turned to Selah. She stood paralyzed, the satchel a brand in her hands. The sheriff, a weary, stoop-shouldered man named Amos Dillard, emerged from the crowd, his pistol drawn, but held low, pointing at the dirt. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tired but firm, "don't you move a muscle. Just set that bag down real slow." Selah's throat was a knot of dust and terror. Her hands trembled as she lowered the satchel to the boardwalk. It landed with a soft, incriminating thud. She looked up, her gaze sweeping over the hostile faces. They saw a drifter, a woman of ill repute, a convenient answer to a violent question. Her past, which she had run so far to escape, had caught her in a new and more terrible way. As the sheriff advanced, her fingers tightened instinctively around her mother's locket. The world blurred, and for a searing moment, she was back in a cramped, cold tenement room, her mother's hand, thin as a bird's claw, pressing the silver into her palm. "Be better than me, Selah girl." Her mother had whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "Find a place where goodness can grow." Selah's eyes snapped back to the present, locking onto the face of Sheriff Dillard. The glint of his badge seemed to mock her mother's final wish. Goodness couldn't grow in soil as hard and unforgiving as this. Here in Harmony Creek, she was already tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, a stranger caught holding the devil's purse. The sheriff's office was a small, suffocating box that smelled of stale tobacco leather and sweat. A single barred window looked out onto the alley where the robber had disappeared, offering no escape, only a reminder. Selah sat on a hard wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. She had answered the sheriff's questions in a voice so small it was barely a whisper. No, she didn't know the man. No, she had never seen him before. Yes, she had just arrived in town. Each answer only seemed to dig her grave a little deeper. Sheriff Dillard sighed, running a hand over his balding head. He was a man worn down by the petty cruelties of a small town, and this was something far from petty. "The thing is, Miss Hartwell," he said, his tone more weary than accusatory. Nobody saw this fella before today. And you just happened to be standing right there at the perfect spot for a handoff. It looks bad. I was looking for work, Sela repeated numbly. That's all. A shadow fell across the doorway. Sila didn't look up. Another pair of accusing eyes was more than she could bear. Amos. The voice was low and steady, a deep baritone that seemed to absorb the tension in the room. William the sheriff acknowledged a note of surprise in his voice. Didn't expect to see you in town. Sela risked a glance. The man in the doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, his face carved by sun and hardship. A faded scar traced a pale line across his left cheekbone. He wore a simple wool coat and dusty boots, but he stood with an unshakable stillness, his gaze missing nothing. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, were fixed on her. She saw no judgment in them, only a quiet, unnerving assessment. This was William Holt. She'd heard the name whispered in the general store, a man who kept to himself on his ranch since his wife's death a year ago. He stepped into the office, bringing with him the scent of hay and open country. What's this about? Bank robbery, William Amos said, gesturing with his thumb toward Sila. This young lady was involved. At least, that's how it appears. William Holt's gaze did not waver from Sila's face. She flinched, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, a useless shield. He saw the tremor in her hands, the raw fear in her eyes, the faint lines of hunger around her mouth. He saw a cornered animal. What was in the satchel, he asked the sheriff. Nothing, Amos grumbled. Not a single coin. Just some woman's things. A book, a handkerchief. Makes no sense. The door opened again, this time with a decisive creak. Eunice Calloway, the owner of the bank, and the town's undisputed matriarch, swept in. She was dressed in immaculate black silk, her silver hair coiled in a severe bun. Her expression was one of profound yet composed distress. Sheriff, she said, her voice smooth and cultured. I trust this criminal is being dealt with. My customers are terrified. The very foundation of our town has been shaken. Her eyes, cold as river stones, flickered over Sila with disdain. We're handling it, Mrs. Calloway, Amos said. William Holt took a step forward, placing himself subtly between Sila and the other two. Amos, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. A person's worth isn't measured by town gossip, nor by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's measured by their actions. What has she done right here, right now, to prove her guilt? The sheriff blinked, taken aback. Eunice Calloway's lips thinned into a disapproving line. William, this is hardly your concern. This woman is a vagrant. It's plain to see. Is it? William's gaze shifted to Eunice. And for a fleeting moment, a tension passed between them that was older and deeper than the events of the day. Looks to me like she's a scared girl who needs a job and a roof over her head, not a jail cell. He turned back to the sheriff. I need a hand at the ranch. Mending fences, helping in the house. I'll vouch for her. She can work off her keep at my place until you find the man who actually robbed the bank. A stunned silence filled the room. The sheriff stared open-mouthed. Sila's head shot up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Eunice's carefully constructed composure cracked a flicker of something sharp and venomous flashing in her eyes before being quickly suppressed. Mr. Holt, that is highly inappropriate. Eunice said, her tone dangerously soft. Think of your reputation. Think of your daughter. It's admirable of you to offer charity, but one must be careful about the kind of strays one brings home. Reputations are so fragile. William ignored her. He looked directly at Sila and for the first time spoke to her. Well, miss, I pay and board and a fair wage. The work is hard, but the food is honest. Sila couldn't find her voice. This man, a complete stranger, was offering her a lifeline when the rest of the world was pushing her under. Why she searched his face for a trick, a hidden motive, but found only a profound and weary sincerity. Yes, she finally managed to whisper. Thank you. Amos Dillard, looking relieved to pass the problem to someone else, nodded slowly. All right, William. On your head be it. But she's not to leave your property without my say-so. And that satchel stays here as evidence. William gave a curt nod. He turned to leave, expecting Scylla to follow. As she rose, her legs trembling, Eunice Calloway stepped closer, her voice a silken threat meant only for Scylla's ears. You've made a powerful friend, girl. Don't imagine for a moment that it will be enough to save you. Scylla hurried out of the office, away from the woman's chilling presence, and into the long golden rays of the setting sun. William Holt was already untying a sturdy horse from the hitching post. He didn't look back at her, simply waited. Without a word, she followed him, leaving the hostile whispers of Harmony Creek behind, as they began the long walk toward the sanctuary, or perhaps the new prison of the Holt Ranch. The road to the Holt Ranch was a dusty ribbon, unwinding through a landscape of rolling hills and sparse, hardy trees. Scylla walked a few paces behind William, the silence between them as wide and empty as the prairie sky. He did not try to fill it with small talk, and she was grateful. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of fear, confusion, and a fragile, unfamiliar flicker of hope. The ranch house came into view as the sun bled into the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of rose and ember. It was a plain but sturdy structure, its boards weathered to a soft gray, with a wide porch and a thin plume of smoke rising from a stone chimney. It looked lived in, but lonely. As they approached, a small figure detached itself from the porch shadows and ran toward them. A little girl of about 5, with fair hair tied back with a simple calico ribbon, and eyes the same clear gray as her father's. "Papa," she cried, her voice bright and clear. She launched herself into William's arms, and for the first time, Scylla saw the hard lines of his face soften as he effortlessly swung her up onto his hip. "Mary Beth," he said, his voice rumbling with an affection he kept hidden from the rest of the world. "Did you finish your chores?" The girl nodded solemnly, her gaze shifting to Scylla. She studied the stranger with an unnerving intensity, her expression a mixture of childish curiosity and a sorrow that seemed too old for her years. Scylla's heart gave a painful lurch. William set his daughter down. "Mary Beth, this is Miss Hartwell. She'll be staying with us for a while, helping out." Mary Beth said nothing, only tightened her grip on the hand-stitched doll she carried. William led the way onto the porch, holding the door open. The interior was simple and clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a well-scrubbed wooden table and chairs sat in the center of the room, and a small kitchen was tucked into the back. It was a man's home, practical and sparse, yet a faint scent of lavender and old books lingered in the air, a ghostly echo of a woman's touch. "You can take the room upstairs," William said, gesturing toward a narrow staircase. "It's empty. I'll bring up some water." Scylla murmured her thanks and ascended the creaking steps. The room was small, tucked under the eaves, with a slanted ceiling and a single window that looked out over the darkening fields. It contained a simple iron bedstead, with a handmade quilt, a washstand, and a small wooden chest at the foot of the bed. It was more than she had had in years. As she set her meager bundle of belongings on the bed, she felt the oppressive weight of her situation settle back upon her. She was a prisoner here, albeit a comfortable one. Every moment was a reminder that she was not free, that her fate rested in the hands of a weary sheriff and a town that had already condemned her. The first few days passed in a quiet, strenuous rhythm. Scylla rose before dawn, helping William with the milking, feeding the chickens, and tending the small vegetable garden that was struggling against the dry soil. She learned the language of his silence. A slight dip of his head was approval. A tightening of his jaw was frustration. A long, quiet look toward the distant hills was grief. He was a man walled in by loss, and she was careful not to trespass. Mary Beth remained a watchful, silent observer. She would follow Sila around the yard, her doll clutched tight, her gray eyes, missing nothing. Sila spoke to her gently, never pushing, offering her small things: a wildflower from the garden, a perfectly ripe tomato. She sensed that this child, like her father, was navigating a world hollowed out by absence. One afternoon, while Sila was mending one of William's shirts on the porch, Mary Beth climbed into her lap without a word and leaned her head against Sila's chest. The simple act of trust was so unexpected, so profound, that Sila froze, the needle still in her hand. She tentatively wrapped an arm around the child's small shoulders, and a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. It was a feeling she had long forgotten, the feeling of being needed. The fragile peace of the ranch, however, could not keep the outside world at bay. When William had to ride into town for supplies, he left Sila with a rifle and firm instructions not to open the door to anyone. The isolation was a constant reminder of her status. She was an outcast, a stain on this quiet man's life. She could see it in the eyes of the ranch hands, two grizzled old-timers named Jed and Silas, who treated her with a wary respect born only of their loyalty to William. She overheard them talking one evening near the barn, their voices low. "Don't seem right," Jed muttered. "The boss taking in a woman like that. Not after Sarah. Boss knows what he's doing." Silas countered, though his voice lacked conviction. "But the stories about that wagon crash never did sit right with me. Too clean, too simple." The words sent a chill down Silas' spine. Sarah's accident. William never spoke of it. The name of his late wife was a locked door in this house of silence. Sila's curiosity mingled with a growing sense of unease about the strangeness of her own situation in Harmony Creek began to take root. Who was the man who had inexplicably saved her, and what secrets did this silent, grieving ranch hold? Driven by a restless energy she couldn't explain, Sila took it upon herself to clean the dusty, neglected corners of the house. One afternoon, while clearing out cobwebs in the small attic, her hand brushed against a small locked chest tucked away beneath a stack of old blankets. It was made of dark cherry wood, and the initials S.H. were delicately carved into the lid. Sarah Holt. Sila's heart hammered against her ribs. This was a violation, a trespass into a place of sacred sorrow. But the words of the ranch hand echoed in her mind. Too clean, too simple. Her own predicament was proof that things in Harmony Creek were not always what they seemed. The robbery, the Satchel Williams' strange act of charity, it all felt connected to a larger, unseen story. Perhaps an answer was in this chest. After a moment of fierce internal debate, her need to understand to survive won out. She carried the chest back to her room. That evening, after William and Mary Beth were asleep, she worked at the simple lock with a hairpin, her hands shaking. It clicked open. Inside, nestled in dried lavender, lay the remnants of a life. Pressed flowers, a small bundle of letters, tied with a ribbon, and a leather-bound journal. With a trembling hand, Sila opened the journal. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, a stark contrast to the rough world outside. The first few pages were filled with joy, her love for William, the birth of Mary Beth, the simple beauty of life on the ranch. But as Sila read on, the tone began to change. A shadow crept into the words. October 12th. One entry read, "My sister visited today. Unannounced as always. She walked through my home as if inspecting it for flaws, her compliments like little shards of glass. She speaks of my good fortune in marrying William, but her eyes say I stole it. She cannot forgive that Papa left this land to me, his younger daughter. She believes it is her birthright." Sila's breath caught. The journal never named the sister, but a cold dread began to seep into her bones. A later entry dated only a week before Sarah's death was even more chilling. She was here again. the shadow from my past. She tried to persuade William to invest in some land scheme, a way to entangle our finances with hers. William, in his quiet way, refused. The look she gave him, it was not anger. It was something colder. She has always coveted what is mine. She once tried to take the silver locket Papa gave me, the twin to her own. I fear her ambition. It is a hunger that will never be satisfied. I pray William never sees the depths of it. His good heart would not understand such malice. Scylla sat back, the journal open in her lap. An estranged, ambitious sister who believed the ranch was her birthright. A woman whose polite surface hid a cold, calculating nature. A woman who wore a silver locket, a twin to Sarah's. The image of Eunice Calloway flashed in Scylla's mind, her cool disdain in the sheriff's office, the veiled threat in her voice. The powerful, respected bank owner. The town matriarch. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture so monstrous, Scylla could hardly bear to look at it. The bank robbery was no random act of violence. The robber hadn't been trying to escape. He'd been delivering a message, a carefully planted piece of a larger, more sinister puzzle. And Scylla May Hartwell had been chosen as the pawn. The weight of the journal in her hands felt heavier than any satchel. It was no longer just her own freedom at stake. She was now the reluctant keeper of a dead woman's secrets, and a terrifying truth was beginning to bloom in the heart of William Holt's silent ranch. The discovery in the journal changed everything. The silence of the ranch no longer felt like a peaceful refuge. It felt like the quiet before a storm. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the window panes seemed to whisper a warning. Scylla now looked at William with new eyes, seeing not just a grieving husband, but a man surrounded by a danger he couldn't perceive. His goodness, the very quality that had led him to save her, was the blindfold that kept him from seeing the truth about his wife's death. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself. But how could she approach him? How could she tell this man who had walled himself off from the world that the polite, powerful woman at the center of town life was a monster who had likely murdered his wife? He would think her mad, or worse, a malicious liar, trying to deflect blame from herself. Her opportunity, or rather her necessity, came a few days later. William announced he was riding into town for supplies, and after a moment's hesitation, said she should come with him. "Amos wants to ask you some more questions," he stated, his tone flat. "Best we get it over with." The ride into Harmony Creek was tense. Scylla felt the weight of Sarah's journal, which she had hidden in the pocket of her dress, like a physical burden. As they entered the town, the familiar curtain of silence and hostile stares fell upon them. Women stopped their conversations and turned their backs. Men on the saloon porch watched them pass with narrowed eyes. Scylla kept her gaze fixed on the horse's mane, her cheeks burning. William seemed oblivious, his expression as unreadable as ever. But she noticed the way his hands tightened on the reins, the rigid set of his shoulders. He felt it too. He was choosing to bear this shame with her. The realization sent a complicated pang of gratitude and guilt through her. At the sheriff's office, Amos Dillard looked more tired than ever. "No sign of that fella," he reported, rubbing his eyes. "It's like he vanished off the face of the earth. The satchel's still here, though." He gestured to the tooled leather bag sitting on the corner of his desk. "Still makes no sense. Why go to the trouble of robbing a bank and run off with an empty bag?" "Maybe he wasn't after the money," Scylla said, her voice quiet but firm. Both men looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" Amos asked. "Maybe he was just supposed to deliver the satchel." "To me," she said, choosing her words carefully, "to make me look guilty." Amos scoffed. Now who'd go to all that trouble? Before Scylla could answer, the door swung open, and Eunice Calloway entered, a basket of freshly baked bread in her hands. "Sheriff, I brought you a little something," she said, her smile as warm and bright as the morning sun. "Oh, William. And Miss Hartwell." I see you're still enjoying the Holt's charity." The condescension in her voice was a physical blow. Selah felt herself shrink back, but the memory of Sarah's words gave her a sliver of courage. Eunice turned her attention to Selah. "You know, dear, I run a small sewing circle for the ladies of the church. We do charitable work for the less fortunate. Perhaps you'd like to join us. It would be a fine way for you to demonstrate a willingness to reform." The offer was a trap. Selah knew it instantly. An invitation into the spider's web where Eunice could observe her, intimidate her, and pump her for information under the guise of Christian charity. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway, but my duties at the ranch keep me quite busy," Selah said, her voice steady. A flicker of annoyance crossed Eunice's face. What a pity. One would think you'd leap at any chance to improve your standing in this community. She placed the basket on the sheriff's desk, her gaze lingering for a moment on the leather satchel. Then she turned, and with a pleasant nod to the men, swept out of the office. The air she left behind felt cold. As they left the sheriff's office, William heading to the general store, Amos pulled Selah aside. "Listen, miss," he said, his voice low. "I might be a small-town sheriff, but I ain't a fool. The way that fella ran, the way he looked, it didn't feel like a professional job. It felt staged. And I'll tell you something else, something I ain't said to nobody." He leaned closer. "That wagon crash that killed Sarah Holt, it never sat right with me. The axle brake was too clean. The way it went over the ravine, I couldn't prove nothing, but it felt wrong." Selah's blood ran cold. The sheriff suspected. He just didn't know who to suspect. That night, back in the quiet safety of her room, Selah knew she couldn't wait any longer. She took out the satchel the sheriff had finally allowed her to reclaim, its contents deemed worthless. She ran her hands over the intricate tooling of the dogwood blossoms, a symbol of rebirth and resilience that now seemed like a cruel joke. She remembered Sarah's journal mentioning her sister's greed, her desire for things that were not hers. Selah began to inspect the bag, with meticulous care, pressing every inch of the leather, probing the seams. Her fingers found it, a small, hard lump hidden beneath the lining in the base of the satchel. With trembling hands, she worked a loose thread with a pin until she could tear a small opening. She reached inside and pulled out a single ornate earring. It was fashioned from silver and turquoise, a distinctive, expensive piece. And it matched a description in Sarah's journal perfectly. "My sister flaunted the new earrings she bought in the city. A gift to myself," she said. "She has always adored turquoise. I find it too cold a stone." The earring was the proof. It wasn't meant for the sheriff to find. That would be too obvious. It was insurance. A piece of damning evidence that could be discovered later, perhaps planted in the belongings of another scapegoat if Selah proved insufficient. The satchel wasn't empty after all. It contained a murder weapon of a sort. The time for silence was over. She had to tell William. She found him in the barn, mending a piece of tack by lantern light. The air was warm and smelled of hay and horses. Mary Beth was asleep in the house. This was the only place he seemed to find any peace. "Mr. Holt," she began, her voice shaking slightly. He looked up, his hands stilling. "Selah, you should be in bed." "I can't. I need to ask you something about your wife." A shudder came down over his face. The familiar wall of grief and privacy rose between them. "I don't talk about Sarah." "Please," Selah insisted, stepping closer into the golden circle of lantern light. "Her accident. Sheriff Dillard said it never sat right with him." William's jaw tightened. "Amos talks too much." "Did she have family?" Selah pressed, her heart pounding. "A sister." He went completely still. The silence stretched thick and heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, with a pain so deep it was terrifying. "They were not close. I don't want to talk about it." His denial was so absolute, so final, that Selah knew she had lost her chance. He was retreating back into his shell. and her accusations would only sound like the ravings of a desperate woman. His refusal to speak of the family conflict was the very inaction Sarah had feared. He had tried to keep the peace through avoidance, and in doing so had left his wife fatally exposed. Scylla retreated, her mission a failure. She now understood she was utterly alone in this. William could not believe her. To save him and his daughter, she would have to confront the monster of Harmony Creek herself. As she walked back to the house under a sky littered with cold, distant stars, she saw the first signs on the horizon, a dark, bruised-looking bank of clouds gathering in the west. A storm was coming, and she knew with a chilling certainty that it would break over all of them. The air grew thick and still the next day, charged with an oppressive electric quality. The sky in the west deepened from bruised purple to a sickly, ominous yellow. The birds fell silent. A dust storm was coming, one of the big ones that could strip paint from a house and scour the landscape clean. It felt like a fitting backdrop for what Scylla knew she had to do. She spent the morning in a state of quiet, focused preparation. She reread the key passages in Sarah's journal, her mind memorizing the words. She wrapped the turquoise earring in a small piece of cloth and tucked it deep within her pocket alongside the journal itself. The evidence felt like both a shield and a terrible weight. She found William by the corral, securing the gate and checking on the horses, his eyes constantly scanning the darkening horizon. "It's going to be a bad one," he said, not looking at her. "We need to get the shutters bolted. I'm riding into town." Scylla said, her voice betraying none of the fear that was knotting her stomach. He finally turned to look at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Now, Scylla, you'll be caught in it." "It's not safe." "I have to," she said simply. "I'm going to clear my name, for good." He saw the new, unshakable resolve in her eyes. It was the look of a woman who had run out of options and had found a strength she didn't know she possessed. He didn't understand what had changed, but he recognized its power. "I'll come with you," he said. "No." Her refusal was sharp. "You need to stay here, with Mary Beth. Bar the door and don't open it for anyone. Please, William. Trust me in this." He searched her face, a war of emotions playing out in his gray eyes, protective instinct, confusion, and a dawning respect. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. He didn't understand her plan, but he understood her determination. Scylla saddled the gentlest of the ranch horses, her movements swift and sure. As she mounted, William placed a hand on the horse's bridle, stopping her. "Scylla," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever you're planning, be careful." She looked down at his calloused hand, at the worry etched on his face, and for a moment her courage faltered. But then she thought of Mary Beth, asleep inside the house, and the woman who had written of her fears in the journal, and her resolve hardened like steel. "I will," she promised. She urged the horse into a canter, not looking back, riding toward the storm and the heart of the town's darkness. By the time she reached Harmony Creek, the world had turned into a surreal, ochre-tinted twilight. The wind was rising, whipping dust and stray leaves into furious eddies. The streets were deserted. Every door was shut, every window shuttered. It was a ghost town, hunkered down and waiting. She tied her horse securely behind the smithy and pulled her shawl over her head, leaning into the wind as she made her way to the bank. The building stood silent and imposing, a fortress of brick and respectability. She pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The air was still and cool. A single lamp burned on a desk in the back office, casting long, dancing shadows. Eunice Calloway sat at the desk, calmly reviewing a ledger, seemingly unperturbed by the elemental fury gathering outside. She looked up as Scylla entered, her expression one of mild annoyance. "We're closed, Miss Hartwell," she said, her voice crisp. "I'm not here for banking," Scylla said, walking steadily toward the office. She untied her shawl, letting the dust settle from it, and stood before the desk. Eunice placed her pen down, her eyes narrowing. "You are trespassing. I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff." "He's probably at home barring his shutters," Scylla said calmly. like everyone else. She placed Sarah's journal on the polished surface of the desk. "I believe this belongs to your family." Eunice's eyes flickered to the worn leather cover. A crack infinitesimally small appeared in her mask of composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Selah opened the journal to a marked page. "My sister visited today. She cannot forgive that Papa left this land to me. She believes it is her birthright." Selah's voice was clear and strong, cutting through the rising howl of the wind outside. The first grains of dust began to seep through the window frames, making the air hazy. A grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly each second, a hammer blow in the suffocating silence. "You're insane," Eunice hissed, her politeness finally dissolving. M.I. Selah reached into her pocket and placed the turquoise earring on top of the open journal page. "Then perhaps you can explain how this ended up in the bottom of a satchel that was shoved into my hands by a man you hired to rob your own bank." Eunice stared at the earring. All the color drained from her face. The mask shattered completely, revealing the raw, venomous hatred beneath. "That foolish girl," she spat. "She never knew how to hold on to what was valuable." "You mean Sarah?" Selah said, her voice a whisper. "You killed her. She stole it from me." Eunice's voice rose, cracking with a lifetime of resentment. "That ranch, that life, William, it was all supposed to be mine. She was weak, sentimental. She didn't deserve it. I gave her a chance. I offered to bring William into a business partnership to share in the prosperity. But he, in his simple-minded honor, refused. They both turned their backs on me." Her eyes glittered with a feverish light. "The wagon accident was a mercy. I simply helped fate along. A loosened bolt, a frightened horse. It was cleaner than she deserved." The confession hung in the dusty air, stark and horrifying. The storm outside unleashed its full fury, rattling the windows in their frames. The lamp flickered wildly. Suddenly, the front doors of the bank burst open with a crash, and William Holt stood there silhouetted against the swirling brown chaos, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. He had followed her. He had heard everything. Eunice's head snapped toward him. Seeing his devastated expression, a cruel, triumphant smile twisted her lips. She wasn't finished. "And you?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You let it happen. You knew. You knew how much I hated her. The poison that was between us since we were girls, and you did nothing. You stood by in your noble silence, believing it would all just resolve itself. Your weakness killed her just as much as my ambition did. You let her die." The words struck William like a physical blow. The truth of them, the terrible, searing truth of his own passive failure, crashed down on him. All the times he had avoided the conversation, all the moments he had chosen peace over confrontation, he saw them now as a series of betrayals. His silence hadn't been strength, it had been a fatal cowardice. As he stood frozen with guilt, Eunice seized her chance. Her hand darted to a desk drawer and emerged clutching a small silver-plated derringer. She aimed it squarely at Selah. "You have ruined everything," she snarled. But in that split second, William moved. He launched himself across the room, a roar of pure anguish tearing from his throat. He crashed into the desk, sending papers and inkwells flying. Selah scrambled back as the two figures grappled for the weapon. The gun discharged with a deafening roar, the bullet burying itself in the plaster wall. The struggle was brief and brutal. William, stronger and fueled by a year of repressed grief and a moment of agonizing revelation, wrenched the pistol from Eunice's grasp. He stood panting over her, his chest heaving, his face a ruin of sorrow and rage. Just then the doors opened again, and Sheriff Amos Dillard stumbled in, his coat covered in dust, his pistol drawn. He took in the scene, Eunice on the floor, William holding the derringer, Selah pressed against the wall, and his weary face settled into a grim understanding. The storm, as if its purpose had been served, began to subside. The wind's howl softened to a mournful sigh. In the dusty, debris-strewn office, the clock continued its relentless, indifferent ticking. The secrets of Harmony Creek had finally been scoured clean. In the days that followed the storm, the dust settled both literally and figuratively, revealing a town irrevocably changed. The arrest of Eunice Calloway sent a shockwave through the community. The town matriarch, the pillar of civility and finance, was a murderess. The story pieced together from her confession and the evidence Sila had uncovered spread like wildfire. The hired robber, a desperate man from a neighboring county, was quickly identified and apprehended, and he readily confessed his role in the staged crime. The stolen bank money was found exactly where he said it would be, buried in a chest on Eunice's property. Harmony Creek was forced to look at itself in the mirror, and it did not like what it saw. The whispers that had once condemned Sila now turned to murmurs of shame and awe. Delegations of townspeople led by the mayor and the preacher made the long trip out to the Holt Ranch. They stood on the porch, hats in hand, and offered halting, awkward apologies to Sila and to William for their blindness. Sila accepted them with quiet grace, offering no recriminations. Their judgment had been a heavy burden, but she had no room in her heart for bitterness. Sheriff Dillard, his weary stoop slightly straighter, found a new confidence in his role. He had trusted his instincts, and they had been proven right. He personally thanked Sila, acknowledging that her courage had solved a crime he never could have on his own. Eunice Calloway, her face a mask of cold fury, was taken by federal marshals to stand trial. Her reign over Harmony Creek was over. But within the walls of the Holt Ranch, a quieter, more difficult reckoning was taking place. The storm had passed outside, but an emotional gale still raged within William. Eunice's final venomous words had unearthed a truth he could no longer ignore. He was not a blameless victim in his wife's tragedy. One evening, as Sila and he sat on the porch watching Mary Beth chase fireflies in the twilight, he finally broke the silence that had defined him for so long. "She was right," he said, his voice rough. He stared out at the fields, but Sila knew he was seeing the past. "Eunice, what she said about me, I knew there was a darkness in her, a jealousy toward Sarah. But I didn't want to see it. I thought if I ignored it, if I just worked hard and provided a good life, it would fade away. I told myself it was just sisterly squabbling. I chose peace over truth." He finally turned to look at Sila, his gray eyes filled with a profound, soul-deep guilt. "My silence was a shelter for her hatred to grow. I failed Sarah." Sila listened, her heart aching for him. She reached out and placed her hand over his. "You loved her, William. You wanted to protect her from ugliness. Your flaw wasn't malice. It was hope. You hoped for the best in people even when they didn't deserve it." She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "You can't carry the blame for her choices. You can only carry the lessons." He looked at their joined hands, then back at her face, illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp from the window. He saw not a rescued stray, but an equal, a woman of immense strength and compassion, who had walked through the fire of judgment and emerged whole. In that moment, the last wall around his heart crumbled. The silence he had cultivated to keep his grief contained was replaced by a shared understanding, a connection forged in the crucible of a terrible truth. Months passed. Autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek in brilliant gold, and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter. Sila's presence on the ranch was no longer a temporary arrangement, but a permanent fixture. She was no longer just a helper. She was the heart that had started beating again in the quiet house. She taught Mary Beth to read. Her laughter filled the rooms, and her steady companionship slowly, gently healed the fractured man who had offered her shelter. One clear, cool morning, beneath the branches of a mighty oak tree, with only Sheriff Dillard and a few trusted ranch hands, as witnesses, William Holt and Sila Mae Hartwell were married. It was a simple ceremony with no sermons or choirs, just the quiet exchange of vows, as plain and sturdy as the iron rings they placed on each other's fingers. Mary Beth stood between them, holding both their hands, her bright face a testament to the family that had been remade. Some weeks later, the three of them rode out together. They didn't take the main road, but followed a small winding trail that led to the edge of a deep, rocky ravine. This was the place where Sarah had died. The air here was still and heavy with memory. For a year, William had avoided this spot, a monument to his greatest failure and loss. But today was different. From a leather satchel, William carefully removed a small sapling, its roots wrapped in burlap. It was a dogwood hardy and resilient, the kind whose blossoms resembled white stars in the spring. Together they worked the hard soil. William dug the hole, his movements strong and sure. Selah knelt beside him, crumbling the earth with her hands, preparing a place for new life. Mary Beth, with solemn importance, placed the sapling into the ground. As they filled the earth back in around the fragile trunk, they were not burying the past, but honoring it. They were planting a marker of remembrance. There was also a promise of growth, a symbol that life, even after the most devastating storm, could find a way to begin again. When they were finished, they stood back looking at the small tree, a defiant patch of green against the rugged landscape. William put his arm around Selah's shoulders, and she leaned into him. Mary Beth slipped her small hand into his free one. They stood there for a long moment, a family forged not by blood or convenience, but by shared truth, forgiveness, and a steadfast love that had refused to be broken by the world's judgment. Then, turning their backs on the ravine, they mounted their horses and rode for home, their shadows stretching long behind them in the afternoon sun.